Welcome back to Chinese Food Fight Club. You're tuning in to an episode where it's just me, Danica Lowe, and my co-host Andy Wong out in LA. Andy, what's going on?
I mean, what's going on is that I feel like we've done a lot of podcasts and we're sort of wrapping it up, and maybe we know some things that we didn't before. I mean, which is really fun. And what else is going on? I'm just like noticing more and more that restaurants, Asian restaurants, all kind of restaurants in LA, like they're buzzing again. So it's not fully back, but I feel like now that a lot of the hopelessness that people felt in the last year has turned into, I mean, maybe not like optimism, but sort of just this pragmatic thing like, okay, we have work to do every single day now, so let's just go do that. Keep our heads down and move forward. And I'm seeing a lot of hardworking restaurants succeed on whatever term success means right now, so that makes me happy.
I totally agree. And I think we're sort of hearing different things come out of New York. I think people are nervous about winter on the East Coast,
Mhm.
but obviously you're in LA and I'm in England right now. Today's a weekday, and I tried to go to lunch at like a local Chinese restaurant here in Oxford. I mean, Oxford only has like 150,000 people in it. The students aren't even fully back yet. I couldn't get into the restaurant. I'm a table of one.
Yeah.
In a way, like, I was like, "This is annoying," but on the other hand, I'm thrilled because this is a restaurant that is owned by a restaurateur in Oxford who has, over the course of the past god, since 1977, owned 3 major Chinese restaurants in town, and last year or a year and a half ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, he had to close the oldest Chinese restaurant in Oxford. It was called the Opium Den. It was here, like, when I was born, it was here when I went to school here, and he had to close it because of the pandemic, and it's great to see that his newest venture is doing so well. And, like, I totally agree with you. I think that things seem to be getting back on track. We're hearing great news out of Asia. Singapore is opening back up this
Yeah.
autumn, winter. All these things are starting to happen, and fingers crossed we keep going down the right path.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll be able to travel to Asia sometime in the near future. I mean, we'll see. So yeah, the thing about all these restaurants being open and the fact that we can sort of travel again, like it was really just underscored to me because one thing that we've learned during this podcast is just how all these things that we talked about are connected, right? And yes, some people have said flattering things about like how I connected this restaurant to this restaurant, but we like you casually mentioned Lucasin and Junzi Kitchen and all the things that his group is doing in New York. And then we had Leo and Lydia from Ricebox on in Los Angeles. And then one day later, I'm just looking on Instagram and hey, Lucas is in Los Angeles and he's eating at Ricebox. And then Leo and Lydia are DMing me saying I'm so proud of what Lucas and his partner have done for Chinese food in New York, and we got to spend some good time with them. And I was just like, yes, you guys are the future. Collectively, you should be connected. And so I think the thing that our podcast is going to do, it's going to just connect these dots that are already on their way to being connected if they're not already there. But it's just going to shine a light on the fact that like this really is this national community, which then sort of like leads to this global community because so many of these people have roots not just in Asia but in other countries beyond that.
I love that Leo and Lydia episode because they had their baby. And Lucas, I guess I'm not surprised that they know each other because Lydia is from Hong Kong and Lucas is also from Hong Kong. And what's interesting about watching that couple and watching Lucas was a Food and Wine Best New Chef this year. And I think watching them, they are not even first generation. They are the immigrants, right? Lydia moved here. She moved to Canada from Hong Kong and then to the US from Vancouver. And her child, that baby, is first generation. And Lucas came to the States from Hong Kong for college. So there's an entire new first generation happening. And that's almost even like 2 generations removed from the generation that we've been harping on about, the people who got involved in food businesses and started becoming entrepreneurs because they wanted to. And so it's so exciting to watch this evolution happen so quickly right before our eyes. I love it so much. And the synergies are incredible. That's one of the things that I put. So Auntie and I wanted to do this episode as like a two-pronged episode. The first part of it was going to be about key learnings from our first season of doing the Chinese Food Fight Club podcast. So we have that. And then we also have, we wanted to talk a little bit sort of about key learnings about ourselves from doing the first season of the Chinese Food Fight Club podcast. And we can talk about that a little bit in the second half of this episode. But I dropped my key learnings about the podcast itself into two categories. One is technical things that I learned about
Yeah.
podcasting, and the other is intangibles. And I think this Lucas, Lydia, Leo conversation sort of falls into one of my key takeaways from the first season. This first season, for me, and Andy, you have been involved in food media continuously for a bazillion years now. But I really stepped away when I left Food and Wine and I moved to Hong Kong to work at Tatler. And for me, this has been a real homecoming to the restaurant community, and in a way that is so much better than, honestly, I mean, no offense to like Food and Wine and Epicurious, but in so much better than my experiences entering the food media community when I had those jobs. Because coming into the first generation Chinese American, Asian American restaurant community and talking to people that you and I know who have very similar shared experiences to us, it feels so much more powerful. And I feel all the warm and fuzzies. I feel all the good vibes. I feel all the love. And this has just been such an amazing season for me personally, just to set like a foot back in to the restaurant industry in this way, in the media way, in the way that we've always wanted to do it, which is talking directly to the people who run the restaurants.
Yeah, and I mean, the wealth that we have of Asian American creators in just the restaurant world, I mean, it's staggering. I mean, I could say on one level, I can't wait to branch out, but we're just going to branch out just because there are so many people to interview. And, another thing that, I think both of us have learned, and this deals with the tech and everything else, is just that, this is a different form of storytelling than what we've traditionally done for most of our careers. This is so obvious, right? And we'll get to that later. But then the other thing is, it's like we've worked on thousands of stories collectively, in our careers, right? We've dealt with all sorts of handlers and managers and PRs and marketing people and branding consultants. And sometimes you go cover an opening and literally there's five different entities that all have PR and they want their separate thing. This thing is totally different because it's like it made me realize that, okay, we're part of this community because this was super easy to do and super easy to book. And I think every single podcast that we did was booked via text or DM, and people were instantly like, yes, I want to do this. And that made me feel really, really good because despite the fact that I've been writing for so long, probably like once every 2 weeks, I get assigned some story and then I have to figure out how do I get what I want. And it turns out getting what you want is more difficult than you think because there's always somebody standing in between you and that who wants to know, well, what is this actually about? And it's like, what it's about is me writing a fucking story like I've written 1,000 times in my life. You know what I do. What are you even asking me? Like, I just really don't have patience for that anymore. But I think for something like this, we're going to always have people that are enthusiastic about it, which is gonna give us the energy to wanna do it.
I also think that just, you and I have worked in so many places and we've written for so many outlets. And honestly, there is not enough of a spotlight on Asian American, Chinese American entrepreneurs in the food space. There's increasingly a
Yeah,
lot, but not nearly enough in terms of representation. If there are more Chinese restaurants in the United States than McDonald's restaurants, then we're definitely not covering Chinese entrepreneurs enough, right? So they're not getting the column ninjas, they're not getting the representation. And I think that I mean, it's so rewarding for us to be able to do that, but I also think that is a big part of people wanting to share their stories because these stories are so powerful. They're not like I don't know, they're not textbook like fine dining, high level culinary arts like I worked for this very, very famous chef, French chef story, and then I started my they're not these there's a lot of humanity and, there's a lot of struggle. There are a lot of family stories involved in these business
yeah.
stories, which makes them so compelling, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked so much about families in this first season, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, right? Given that, the way that most Asian Americans are raised, right? Where they're sort of like a little secretive, right? About like what their family life is, or it's not something that you know, it's a type of thing where they're very, very proud of their families, but they have a hard time expressing it, right? I just think that like that's part of being Asian. We all know that. But what I found over and over again, like in these interviews, is that you and I talk about our families because it just naturally comes up because it ties into the topic that we're talking about. And when we ask all of these chefs and restaurateurs and entrepreneurs about their lives, one thing that keeps coming up is just how their family influenced this, whether their family approved, and also how they admire their family because their family had obviously very serious struggles compared to what they themselves have gone through now. And so I think that it really is this universal thing. And, maybe catharsis is the wrong word for it, but I think that all the people that we've had on are eager to talk about it because it's not typically what they get asked in their 15-minute interviews for, say, a food and wine story.
I totally agree, and I think if we want I wanna, like, marry the 2 columns on my piece of paper here between key learnings about the technology
Yeah,
of
do it.
podcasting. I think, like, one of the things that I think I tried to learn a lot about before we started doing this. And you guys, like Andy and I are just doing this with expensive-ish microphones we bought from apple.com, from our houses on our laptops. Like we're not in a studio. We're not at that point yet. We want to get there, but we're not there yet. And I think a lot of the instructions on YouTube, on the web by professional podcasters, they talk about the importance of sound. You have to have this. You have to have a soundproof room, podcast from your closet, get everyone a microphone. And logistically, we haven't been able to do that. And working with chefs and people who are running one man shows in restaurants or two people or like two people shows in restaurants, it's just not practical for
Yeah,
them to go find like a closet and a soundproof room to hide in and like a $500 microphone to talk into. And what I've really learned about our experience is that for us, for this podcast, sometimes we might have to prioritize the story over the sound quality. And this is why Andy and I are actually doing this both over audio as well as we're posting the videos on YouTube so people can watch it and see people's facial expressions and see the baby
right.
who was on the
Right.
podcast a couple of weeks ago and see all these things just to understand context. These are working parents. These are business owners who haven't slept in 4 days, and I think that that is such an important thing to take into consideration. I mean, it was something that I was nervous about it in the beginning, with the first time someone called in and I was like, "I can't hear them very well." But
Right.
then I think the story became so compelling that the sound became the number 2 priority. Obviously, our goal is the goal is to have, like, a studio and have people come to us, but that's not always possible, and sometimes it's more important to do the storytelling.
I mean, I completely agree. I mean, okay, fine. Maybe at some point we're going to get to become like whatever this professional talk show that's on the internet or something. If that happens, great. If that doesn't happen, I also kind of really don't care because, like you said, we're covering chefs and we're covering small businesses and we're covering businesses that, like, on any given day, if something goes right or something goes wrong, you're suddenly you yourself packing 100 extra takeout orders or you're fixing your own sink. That's just it, right? Something bad happens, you're the plumber, right? You know, and this is true of some of the most high profile chefs, Asian American or not. I've had so many people tell me this like over the years. Like that's what it means to be a chef and a business owner. And it was interesting that you bring this up because like I was doing Clubhouse for a while, and I mean I still am, but like I was doing Clubhouse on the regular every week for a while with my friend Crystal Kozer. We did LA Food Gang on Clubhouse, and it was great. And Crystal was a little bit more of a stickler than I was about like a certain level of polish, right? Because there are some chefs that came on and one of them was like in their car and it was loud and you couldn't hear, and then one of them was like literally in the kitchen during the service and you heard like when somebody like accidentally dropped a pan, and Crystal would always text me like, "We got to stop this from happening." And then I was like, on one level we do, but on another level, this is fucking crazy that the chef with Michelin stars is standing in his kitchen right now at 8 o'clock at night on a Sunday because we asked him to and just trying to talk to us. This to me is very, very real. Maybe this is actually what Clubhouse is for. Clubhouse isn't recorded. So yes, I totally get it if the sound is terrible, 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 and there's background noise, people are going to tune out. But to me, like it's just going to be this constant push pull of like, the realness in the indie versus the polished and the corporate. And I feel like I'm always going to kind of side for the world of indie. Like if somebody gives us a crazy $1 million sponsorship, great. But I still think that like if some chef is basically just like, yes, I can do this interview, but it's just me in the restaurant today. Can I do it from the restaurant or should we reschedule? I'm usually going to say, let's not reschedule. Let's just try it.
I think also, I mean, this also another technological thing that Andy and I really had to come face to face with was it's finding a good platform to do this on because we're remote. It's actually so difficult to record in real life, and I think that we went through a lot of platforms. We tried a lot of different things,
Yeah.
but I think, like, there's so much opportunity for these live streaming and podcast recording platforms to be able to, stream live from a kitchen if there was a way for us to get, like, great mics clipped to people, and I think that that's all possible, and I this is my dream for this podcast is to become and this is gonna make me sound old, but it makes it my dream is for it to almost become like a, "And now to you, Andy, in Las Vegas," and you'll be in some, like, amazing kitchen. Like, it's almost like the evening news, like, that to me is what it's like because I'm 100 years old, but it's not like that. I feel like that to me is like the dream of what this can become, a sort of a place where you can tell local stories and individual stories on a platform that can reach so many people and that can live forever in so many different media formats.
Yeah. And I think that you can end up being super professional, right? And whatever, for lack of a better term, super elite like that, and still keep the looseness of the format overall, which is what I think that we're also drawn to because this is different than the interviews that, we otherwise do every day because it's like I mean, this is going to be boring for most people, but I just want you to understand that like our lives are not that glamorous. They're boring. So you're interviewing some really famous celebrity or you're interviewing some chef, right? And you have this mandate for this piece that you're supposed to turn in and you have a word count. So much of the interview is interrupting or doubling back because you need to get certain things. What's the name of this person that you just mentioned? Could you spell it for me? How old were you when this happened? Wait, what city were you? Wait, I think the chronology is off a little bit. So your mom worked in this restaurant and then your aunt worked in the restaurant, but your uncle opened it? Like, and then you realize that, like, if you just taped that and played it back to somebody, it would just be like, this isn't a fucking conversation. This is more like, like you're interrogating somebody, like you're investigating something, and you end up getting the story. And if you're good at it, writing something super beautiful. But I like this sort of looseness of just letting people talk and not having to interrupt them 100 times just to like clarify. So wait, what are the four ingredients in that sauce? Because my editor really needs to know that. And I think that like this makes it
I
feel
yeah.
the stuff that comes out when you just let people talk ends up being better. And it doesn't have to be comprehensive. And it doesn't have to be, completely correct. I mean, I'm not gonna name any of them because this is not shade, but I listen to so many of the, most popular, most prominent podcasts, and they're just like in the middle of it, huge misstatements or huge factual errors or something. And you know that these people are smart and they know, or somebody told them, and they just decided, you know what? We're not changing that because we know the general meaning of it is correct and nobody's going to give a shit that like I named one fruit when it was really another fruit? Because that's what happens in real life. So it's this weird thing that's closer to in real life than when we sit down, on our keyboards and try to type a story. And that's been kind of illuminating to it.
Honestly, I after we record these podcasts, after we're done with the episode and we hang up, there's like 30 to 45 minutes where I'm like gripped in terror, where I'm like, "What did I say? Why did I say that? That was
Right.
wrong. I
Where
used
did
the
it
wrong
come
word." I
from?
use and I just have to and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, people are going to tweet at me saying that, Danica, you're an idiot." One, I'm okay with it because you and I cut our teeth at the New York Post, and listen, people called me all the time there on the telephone and called me an idiot on the phone, and so I have a
Yeah.
pretty thick skin, and but at the same time, I agree with you. I think that this medium is very pure. It's really hard to issue corrections for podcasts, and nobody really wants to read like a, well, instead of this word, Andy and Danica should have said this word. I think that people understand conversation and understand that you get the gist of something. But this leads into one of the other things that you and I wanted to talk about on this episode was, and we joke about this, but this is again something I was like seized with terror over. But this is the idea of quote unquote being a bad Chinese person. And this plagues me all the time, especially when we're talking in public on a platform about issues that affect billions of people around the world. And
Right.
okay, yeah, we're talking about food, but these are still intertwined with a lot of family issues, a lot of social issues, a lot of race issues, a lot of ethnicity issues, a lot of heritage things, and it's going to land on everyone's ears in a different way. But Andy and I joke all the time because we are first generation Americans. There's not we don't know that much about our heritage. We know what our, and I hate this term, but I'm going to use it. We know what our lived experience has been as first generation Americans. Andy growing up in Texas, me growing up in Queens, New York. But I think there's a lot that we don't know, and I think that this podcast talking about food and talking to people from all over the Chinese, Asian American diaspora. I feel like I've already learned so much in just a few episodes. I don't know how you're feeling about that.
I mean, I feel like yes, I've learned a lot, or it's at least like made me realize that in some ways I know less than I think, but in a lot of ways we collectively like we know more. And we do have a lot of these experiences that other Asian American creators have had. So I think we've all been thinking about it, and it's just like with so many things, like we've just been internalizing it. So it's just a matter of bringing out some of our knowledge. And like, look, I will completely cop to being a bad Asian, right? A bad Chinese American person. And, if I go to a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant, I'm the first person there, I could say maybe 9 words of Mandarin or 20 of Taiwanese if it's a Taiwanese restaurant to get myself sat and all that. And then beyond that, I'm done. I fully admit to that. When I go out with Carol Chin and Shirley Chung, we always, Carol and I always joke about like who's the least Asian of the two of us because Shirley's the one who's actually Chinese, and can speak and can figure things out. And I mean, I think that's okay, right? Obviously, it's okay. We have no choice. This is who we are because the way that we were raised and all our life experiences got to this point. So, yeah, maybe we're in some ways more American than we are Chinese, but that's allowed us to get to this point to tell these stories because I don't think that you and I would have the resources or the confidence had we not basically been telling American stories in American publications for most of our adult lives.
Uh, so this is what I do when I feel like nervous about making mistakes, but also because I want to learn. And because like my number one pet peeve with podcasts, and I'm so nervous to like become this person. And I do feel like I've made some like misstatements this season. So like literally these things keep me up at night. But my number one pet peeve
Really?
in podcasts
Yeah.
is when people talk authoritatively about things that they clearly don't know anything about. And so I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try to do as much reading as possible about Chinese food, the history of Chinese food in Chinese culture and throughout the Chinese diaspora, and just in general about just thought pieces about Chinese food. So this is what I did. I bought books. Now, this is one of the things that I've noticed about trying to buy books about Chinese food in culture. This as a category is so difficult to find in English. I don't even know if it exists in Chinese anthropology, like in anthropology studies or in terms of like that kind of academic study. I'm sure it does, but I can show you what I got. I have 5 books here that I got. Two of them you can easily get. Two of them are written by Fuchsia Dunlop, who is one of the biggest,
Right.
most important authorities on Chinese food. So this is Every Grain of Rice. And what I love about Fuchsia Dunlop's books is that she combines practical things like their recipes. So this is Land of Fish and Rice. They're beautiful. These are just beautiful recipe books with photos. But her writing is deep. It's not just "Oh, this is like put some soy sauce." Like, she explains things. She's a
Right.
storyteller. And the other 3 books were really hard to get. It was like on Amazon where you have to go and it's like, "Other buying options." It's like, instead of paying $8 for the book, it's like $57. I'm like, "Okay, I'm just gonna buy it because it's important." So, here's a book. It's called The Globalization of Chinese Food. It's an anthropology book published by a group of professors at the Chinese University in Hong Kong and at the Central University of Nationalities in Beijing. This is like a dense anthropology book. This is one of the earlier books that I found published in the US about Chinese food. It's a 1988 book. It was published by a professor at UC Riverside. Now, it seems that UC Riverside has a really robust department of professors who do extensive historical research on Chinese food.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but I don't know if he's still at Riverside. This is quite an old book, so I don't know if he's retired, but could be interesting to talk to some people
Yeah.
from that department on the podcast. And then this is a compendium by some of the professors from Riverside, plus professors from Berkeley, Harvard, Princeton, and Yale about food and Chinese culture. Now, these are like really dense academic books, but generally, it was really hard to find anything published in English about Chinese food in context and not just recipe books. So
Right.
this is, you know,
Yeah. So, I mean, the fact that this hasn't been documented that extensively, I mean, it's not surprising to me, right? Obviously, like, given how many stories end up being marginalized or hidden or forgotten. I mean, that part is obvious. But also, I mean, you're mentioning the Fuchsia Dunlop book, just like with all the beautiful pictures and all that. I mean, I feel like what you're saying is that there's a huge opportunity for somebody. I mean, I'm not saying it's us. I mean, I'm sure as hell not actually saying it's us. Maybe we're a small part of it. But to sort of create something, online with beautiful pictures that ends up being an explainer for lots of people that are interested in these things. I mean, you and I have talked about this before, right? About like, wouldn't it be great just to annotate a menu, right? And it could be any kind of menu. It could be Italian menu, it could be Filipino menu because guess what? There are people who go to restaurants all the time and they're just intimidated, right? Because they're just like, why does it say spaghettone instead of spaghetti? What does that mean? Is that thicker or thinner? And they're like embarrassed. What is porchetta if there's not a and it's the same thing like with any Chinese restaurant where like you look at the pictures and you go to a restaurant and you ask your Chinese friends, like, what should I order? And they're like, you should get Shen Pao, you should get Xiaolong Pao. But if you're just some American person, you look at the menu, it's like, I don't understand which dumpling is which dumpling. Please explain, right? So, yeah, I feel like there's still a lot of education that could happen. And you can do it yourself just by going to restaurant after restaurant and asking questions. But that obviously doesn't always work because of language barriers. So somebody could see you're like, I'm looking at all these dense books, and I'm like, God, somebody should make an iPhone app that basically has all of this shit, right?
wouldn't it be cool to just go collect menus from all like the top Chinese restaurants in certain cities and do that? I think it's totally do I mean it's a
Yeah,
huge project. We're gonna have to get an intern. But
yeah,
and then we'll have them drive around LA and then they can compile all the menus. But I completely agree. And I don't know if you've noticed this in on the West Coast. I feel like this is to me, I've only seen this over the past 10
all
years.
right,
I feel like growing up, Korean menus were always illustrated with photos in New
yeah,
York. Japanese menus, not so much. Sometimes if it's like sushi and they wanted to show you like what color the sushi was,
hmm,
but in general, like if you go to a high-end Japanese restaurant, you're not going to see illustrations or photographs on the menu. But Chinese restaurants recently, especially with more regional Chinese restaurants like Sichuan restaurants, they like to show pictures. And I
yeah.
wonder if it's because the for from some regions the food is way more colorful and photogenic than from other regions. I don't know if that's part of it.
I mean, I think that makes sense because if you think about Hunan food, Sichuan food, Uyghur food, just a lot of these things that have dramatic presentations, often involving chilies. I know what a lot of these dishes are because I've seen the pictures on menus. You know what I mean? That's totally anecdotal, but yeah. And certainly, like, I think some restaurants purposely, do pictures of some of their like baller items, like the whole 3 pound lobster ginger and scallion. So you actually, get to see it on a table for scale to be like, oh, yeah. This thing costs $200, but I should probably order it. But yeah, it'd be great. I was talking to this restaurateur in LA, Marissa Hermer, who's totally just this very savvy restaurateur who, runs restaurants that are sort of like they're not clubs, but they're definitely nightlife adjacent. They're like the hot scene restaurants, right? And she used to work in PR in New York for Syndicate, where she repped Ian Schrager, and she also was on the Ladies of London reality show. So she's just like lived all these lives, but because of that, she's really like learned a lot of things about marketing and branding. And she told me this amazing thing about technology, and it made me think that like there's so many apps that could be built around similar things. So you can go on Shazam if you're trying to create a playlist for your restaurant or bar or your party or whatever, and Shazam, whatever, what's being played at the three hottest nightclubs in Mykonos or Ibiza. And the great thing about Shazam is that the things that people are Shazamming are the things that they don't know yet, right? So this is a real time tracker of what's the new thing that everybody's trying to figure out what it is. And I can have that now. And I just feel like if you think about that technology, how everything's connected. I mean, obviously, like Postmates and Uber, they don't release it all the time. They do sometimes. They have data on like what dishes people are ordering. But if there was like some crazy database, right, where you could figure out like via Yelp or anything else, not like all of a sudden people in these three states have been ordering a lot of Hanan chicken or whatever, that will tie into a story about so many things, including the migration patterns that you're so obsessed with, just to be like, why is this little town outside here, like why are all these people now suddenly eating like crab curry or whatever? And that data doesn't really exist anywhere, but I want to like live in this dream world where it does exist. But of course that ties into something else that we've learned this season where, you can kind of tell by now that I love talking about like tech and dystopia and the metaverse and all these other things that are may or may not happen in the future. And so part of me is like, wouldn't it be great to just like have this database of like what everybody's ordering? Then the other part of me is like, well, but then that's also would be the equivalent of Google Glass, like recording your every moment and then you being able to play it back. At what point does it stop? I don't know. I'm just saying that I would really, really love to know like what Chinese food is trending like all over America, or even just like statistics about how in the parts of America where there used to just mainly be all you can eat Chinese buffets, hey, what kind of regional Chinese food has ended up opening there because it's now more diverse because of migration patterns and palates are more mature now. I'm endlessly fascinated by that. I don't know how we're gonna, you know, quantify that ever, but I think what we'll do on the podcast is we're gonna try to find some people that aren't just in New York and in LA who can tell us some things about, hey, this is what's happening with Chinese food in my town or in my city.
I would love to have, like, the data guy from Deliveroo or from Grubhub or from Seamless or from Postmates come on a show, and, like, I mean, I would love to see these companies make infographics actually,
Yeah,
just about, like, what people are ordering where. But this is a new world, new digital world version of that story that opened that book that Jennifer 8 Lee wrote all those years ago, The Fortune Cookie
right.
Chronicles, about Chinese food in America. And the book, if you guys haven't read this book, it is so good and it's such an easy read and so smart, so well written. It opens with an anecdote about this one lottery drawing in like the early 2000s, like 2003, 2005 maybe, where so many people all over the United States won that second prize one, the one where if you get five numbers right, you get like $250,000, but like a record number of people won that jackpot. And it turns out that all of those people had ordered Chinese food the night before. They had all gotten their fortune cookies and they all played the number that was on their fortune.
Uh,
And because fortune cookies, by and large in the US, are made predominantly by two or three different companies, there are only so many little slips of paper with numbers that go around. And those were the numbers that were drawn. So there is something that unites the entire country
yeah.
with Chinese food. And I think that there is so much interesting data. I'm sure there's like millions of amazing stories that come out of this.
Yeah, and I even just want to like see statistics about certain things, right? Okay, maybe I can't have all of these like all of this data that I want. And honestly, it's probably good that I'm never going to get it, right? But like every year in Las Vegas, the you know, big hotels like Wynn especially, they have statistics on how many pounds of king crab are served, right? How many pancakes are made. And I guess this may just be the mathematical Asian side of me, but I really would just want to know that, like, you know, in New York, Flushing, and like this is a pipe dream, but like I want to know, like, whatever, how many xiaolongbao are rolled, on any given day. And if I can't know that, maybe Din Tai Fung will at least explain like how like the volume of one of the restaurants. I mean, maybe we can get that. Like I've had like people from like who run the Din Tai Fung company, like publicists have sent me things about, hey, do you want to get in touch with them? And I mean, maybe now we have a different reason, right?
I think and I'm so curious because eh, these big Chinese food corporations and Chinese restaurant companies are the only ones who we have like a slim chance of getting this information from them. Because I'm just thinking as you're talking, if we went to like the most popular mom and pop shop back in like Taiwan and asked them these questions, they'd be like, get out of my store.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
so if we gotta go to Din Tai Fung to get this info, great, let's do it.
Right. But like even something like Goldbelly, where Shirley Chung and Ricebox are both on it, they know what their numbers are. I mean, Goldbelly sent out information saying that Shirley was the top seller in Los Angeles, and that's great. And I'm sure Shirley will tell us personally, but wouldn't it be great, just to then for other Asian creators to realize she has sold this many dumplings and this many tea smoked ducks, because it's like the thing that I was telling Leo and Lydia when they were here, and it's the same thing that, like, you can say to Lucas. There are people now who see young entrepreneurs like Ricebox and the group of Junzi Kitchen, and they're just like, oh, we wanted to do something like this, but they did it first. Shit, what are we going to go do instead? And my response to them always is just like, you're still so early, and I wish there was some way I could quantify how these places are crushing, but also how their market share is tiny. And they know that. And there's so much room for them to grow and other people to grow with them. Because that's ultimately the other thing that we want. Because we're encouraging people to, like, Chinese American chefs to open like at every college campus in America. I want this to be this ubiquitous part of food and food culture where, when you go to every shopping mall food court, you're gonna see the Sbarro, and yes, you're gonna see the Panda Express still, and the Chipotle. But why can't there be a Szechuan fast casual or Hunan fast casual or a Cantonese barbecue fast casual, like in that same place? I mean, people love that food. That food is very Instagram friendly. That food is very, very built around efficiency too. Just like a Panda Express, it's the type of thing where if you did it correctly, and I mean, I know some pretty prominent chefs in LA that are working on this, it's like it solves issues with labor too, because things can get pre-cooked at like one commissary, shipped to different places, and then your employee structure is somebody at the register and somebody scooping, right? And it sort of fixes the problems that a lot of people are having with restaurants and trying to stay solvent in the restaurant business. So I just really want that selfishly for myself, so that every time I take my family to whatever, a mall or amusement park or a stadium, there's just this option, and it's not like ghettoized. Like we're about to talk to the guys at Soul Sausage for something else that we're working on, and they've been in a lot of prominent NFL stadiums. They're in the LA soccer stadium now, so they have a lot of experience. But what they've noticed, like traveling around the country, is just that there are lots of stadiums where it's just like, okay, we have Asian food, but all the Asian food is in one corner. And if you think about it, that doesn't make any fucking sense, right? If you're Soul Sausage, right? Because it's like, why do the people making Korean barbecue sausages, why are they next to the people like whatever making noodle bowls and making pho and making ramen and making sushi? Yes, they're all Asian, right? Okay, so whatever, you have this yellow section, but you would maximize sales for all of this shit if you put Soul Sausage near to the place where people are buying fucking hot dogs and hamburgers, because here's another sausage on a bun. That's what it actually is. And also, they're Korean American. They have a lot of American flavors too. Like they have like these cheesy egg rolls and all these other things that they're doing. So I just feel like I'm not gonna be personally satisfied until all this Asian American food is just considered, "Okay, this is just another form of American food, and it's everywhere," which is what I think it's what we both want.
I think so. I totally agree. And you know what? So, I mean, but I've spent the last 3 years outside of the U.S. And I think, you and I both have traveled so much. We've been so lucky. My number one thing that I would love to open outside of the US is Chipotle. But in the same way that Chipotle does not seem to leave the US and open in Europe, in England, in Asia, and wherever, I've been in the past few years, there are millions of amazing, amazing Chinese, Asian, Korean, Japanese chains all throughout Asia serving billions of people. None of them want to come to America. I don't know
Yeah.
why, but it's the same thing. In a way, like we don't even need to reinvent the wheel, right? The same way that Pinkberry became so massive in the US in the very early 2000s, there's no reason why. I mean, look at what Jollibee is doing now.
Oh,
But
yeah,
there's
my god.
no reason why these massive, amazing chains that exist already in the Asian world that serve amazing, mass-produced Asian food in an incredible distribution system, I think there's no reason that they don't expand their businesses at least to the East and West Coast in the US,
Yeah,
selfishly.
and, obviously, like, we have Din Tai Fung, we have Jollibee in LA. I mean, those are both very, very popular, and I've talked to different chefs and restaurateurs about this, and I understand, like, especially with Japanese food, when you're buying really specific fish, that supply chain issues just make it really, really hard for you to scale like that. That's great, but now it's been proven, right, that the thing about Chinese food is that you can ship it over dry ice overnight and send it to somebody and it still tastes good, and you can do this at a pretty high volume, which means that there's a demand for it, right?
Mhm.
Like, if every city where, like, Shirley Chung has been, like, selling hundreds, if not thousands of dumplings, just had a little kiosk in some mall where you could go and buy dumplings, it would probably do pretty well. 'Cause that
Yeah.
and so much of this now, obviously, like we've talked about, has to do with internet fame, and obviously a chef like Shirley has, been on Top Chef and been very successful on it multiple times and has all these other TV appearances. So, yeah, a lot of them are already building these global brands for people recognize them. They just happen to only have restaurants in one city right now.
I'm trying to think of examples of chains that have worked. But I mean, obviously, every country is different. Every culture is different. I remember living in Egypt 20 years ago, and someone had told me that KFC was very successful in Egypt, but Taco Bell, because in the States, it's like
Yeah.
Taco Huts, right? So yeah, KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut all in one place. So Pizza Hut and KFC work very, very well overseas in many, many countries. But Taco Bell is very specific. It either hits or completely misses. And at the time, it was the year like 2000 when I was living there. People told me that Taco Bell had tried to enter the market, spent so much money building out outlets, advertising, but at the end of the day, because it was meat, vegetables, rice on a wrap, people locally were like, "What's so special about this? We've
Yeah.
got meat, rice, vegetables in a wrap." So I think it hits and misses, and I think you see, for example, I mean, I'm just thinking. I always try to think about how it works both ways and whether these rules can be applicable going the other way. But Taco Bell is just starting to pick up in the UK, and there's some outlets in London, some outlets in bigger cities like Brighton. There's Wendy's is just re-entering the UK for the first time in a decade. So Wendy's has one or two outlets right now. They're opening a third one in Oxford. But there's a reason that these chains have started and failed. Five Guys does incredibly well all over the world.
Right.
So there must be a reason why. I don't know. I agree with you. I would love to see
I would love
amazing
it.
Asian chain restaurants.
This would be, I mean, like, look, I get that this is harder than I'm making it sound. 100% it's way harder. I mean, we
We
remember
just
the
talk.
yeah, but I remember that, like, Chipotle had Shop House, right? And they were basically trying to do some version of this. But I remember the problem with Shop House, it was that it was just like vaguely all of these things. And it wasn't really like one thing. You could go there and taste something like vaguely Vietnamese and like vaguely Chinese and vaguely Korean. And it was just like this mishmash of all this fusion stuff that was fine, but wasn't the thing that you really craved, right? And I think what we're saying is like, look, this is my dream that this happens, but in reality, though, there is a market, and this is what we're going to keep seeing, whether the other thing happens or not. Of That's been proven of you can open extremely legit Chinese restaurants near college campuses in America where there's a large Chinese student population. And I think that's sort of where it starts, right? And then that might then, inspire some of these people in college to realize, like, you know what, this can actually be a good business moving forward. And here's how I do this. But, and combine it with whatever, a bar or a speakeasy or social media or the metaverse or secret parties or whatever. There's going to be somebody, right? Because it's just like you look at something like Sweet Green, right? Which is one of the unicorns in that space, started by three, yes, you know, kids from well-connected families, but still three college kids at Georgetown, and they wanted to do lots of other things too. Like they had a music festival for a while that was part of this, right? They had like DJs and stuff, and a lot of this stuff like didn't end up, taking in terms of being a permanent part of their brand, but it sort of helped define who they were because that was sort of the ethos. They were like three entrepreneurial friends who had varied interests, including wanting people to eat more healthful food, and they built a business out of that. So I think that like there are these things, right? Kava Grill is another unicorn, and that's giving people Mediterranean food. So I just think that there's room for something besides Panda Express. And I mean that I'll leave it at that and wait for somebody else to do it.
I 100% agree. And I don't know if you noticed, but so Chinese Food Fight Club also has a website where we're going to be putting all of our episodes so you can watch all the videos in one place. We'll be putting all of our show notes there in addition to on the podcast and in the description box in the YouTube videos. But also on that site is our about page. And our about page that is currently a work in progress, but by the time this is published, it should be correct. I've added because Andy and I have a lot of opinions, I've added that we are also a consultancy. Hope you don't mind. I wrote
Sure.
that we are a multimedia platform and consultancy because I think that between you and I, like, I think that we have a lot of perspective on what's actually happening in the industry and outside of the industry and around the world.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had, multinational companies in the last year reach out to me about just, for insight about different food trends and all that. So, yes, if you want to pay us a lot of money and sponsor a podcast to tell you about what we've seen, over the last few years, or like, flavors and colors and things that are doing really, really well, like restaurants, yeah, absolutely, we can do that. It's one of those weird things where I don't think I'm glad that you're saying we're a consultancy, Danica, because it's one of those things that I never think about. But then once every couple months, somebody will call me and be like, "Hey, I'm working on this. Can you help me?" Or recommend something. And it turns out it's like, "Yeah, I actually can help you. I do know that." So I think that, like, yeah, we're gonna be very, very American about this and just be like, "Yeah, we will take your money."
Speaking of being American, this is something that I've really, like, really learned or really just noticed from doing this first season. And I think I think I always knew this, but I didn't realize how quickly it happened across just one generation. So everybody we've talked to, more or less everybody we've talked to has been first generation or a recent immigrant themselves. And I'm sort of like caught in between zero and first generation, your first generation. But I think it's been so interesting just hearing the stories and hearing how quickly Asian becomes American, right? Like,
Yeah,
I think that to me these things are actually very distinct in my mind because I think of them not just in terms of heritage, but I really think of them as cultures and how you and I like joke about how we're always like open franchises, spread across America, get the money, scale. And I think that's definitely a very American approach to everything. We just sort of, let's just throw everything at it, right? Let's just go. Whereas I think I don't want to say that we lack integrity, but I do think that there's a cultural integrity that we may miss about the being Asian part, and that's something that I would like to get more in touch with, but that has just become starkly apparent to me over the course of this season.
yeah, and I think that we're approaching this on some level as experts, but let's be really, really true to this thing, right? We're experts about a lot of things, and we're also just fucking dilettantes about other things, right? And it's not something that like is about shame or pride. It's just about reality. Danica and I are interested in a lot of things at the same time, and those interests, tend to change over time. And what's happening right now, because of the pandemic, because of technology, because of all these things that people are trying to do to like keep their restaurants and restaurant companies solvent, the stories like they just are changing on such a rapid basis where it's like last year, like before the pandemic, I didn't really think that much about delivery services except like they were cool, right? And I didn't think about all these other things. And so now, if you wanted me to tell you like why DoorDash is great, but also why DoorDash is fucking terrible, and why something like Toast and what like had a successful IPO, or why something like Chow now is promising, I can talk to you about that now, right? Because it used to be that I was just some dilettante who's like, I'm just gonna. I mean, like, I think the first story I wrote for Food and Wine was just about, yay, food delivery is so great. They'll bring me all this crazy shit. It's cheaper than taking an Uber. It's cheaper than parking. So I think that the good thing is that you sort of start off from one place and then you really dig into like, no, this is important. I should actually learn more about this. So we're gonna approach a lot of things, when we don't know that much about it, and then we're gonna approach a lot of things that we've thought about for a long time. And I think that like if you join us for like future podcasts, you're gonna be able to tell. We're never gonna really try to trick you, right? And so there's a lot of things that we're trying now, like Shirley Chung, Carol Chin, and I, and this digital ATM company, we're launching an NFT. Yes, I consider myself kind of an NFT expert. I will also admit I've been buying NFTs for about a month. I consider myself sort of a cryptocurrency expert. I've been buying cryptocurrency for 3 years, but that was after people had been talking to me about it for 3 years prior. And honestly, I was an idiot for maybe not listening to them earlier. But here's my point about all of this, which is maybe just the ongoing theme, right? There are all these things where it's like, I don't know anything. I'm too late. And like, I think this podcast is here to tell you, it's like, you're still early. Like, we can learn a lot of this stuff together. We could fail at a lot of this stuff together. I can throw out these business ideas and I want somebody to like get on and just basically tell me like it would be so fucking stupid to try to open 30 Szechuan restaurants at college campuses, and here's why. Do you know how hard it is to get this or whatever? Great. I want to know all these things, right? I want you to like make my dreams come true, and I also want people to come and like kill my dreams, because it's like this is what it is, right? And because we like to be experts, because we are dilettantes, I mean, we're resilient in that way. If somebody convinces me that some great idea I have is stupid, okay, fine. Here's my other 37 ideas. Do you like any of them? Oh, they're all stupid? Great. Let's go talk about tech or our families. We're still going to have a fun conversation,
100% I agree. I agree with everything you said. When you and I launched this podcast, we said to each other, we're like, we don't really know what we're doing. We're just going to go into this as a learning experience. And I think it's such a privilege to be able to do this. And this is a great place to wrap up. And I hope everyone tunes in for season two. I have ideas about season two, and we can talk offline about
Yeah.
that.
All right. Thanks
But
for being
yeah,
here, everyone.
thanks for listening to season one of Chinese Food Fight Club. And we'll see you next season.